सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Evil clouds of smoke billowed from the screaming metal bowels of the aging local transport bus, shrouding its passengers in exhaust fumes and noise as they lurched up the churned-up mud track into a nightmare. The three Kalashnikov-carrying men who had hijacked the bus near Jammu and Kashmir's Kishtwar back in 1993 had ordered out the children and women. Then they told the driver to move on. At a meadow on the edge of the Sarthal forests, the passengers were asked to call out their names and segregated into two groups. 14 Hindu passengers bled out on the roadside that sunny morning, their torn up bodies collapsing into a single bloody heap. 2 more died on the journey to a local hospital. The New Year morning of 6 Rajouri residents by jihadists, the first such mass killing in years, has raised fears that the murderous communal war in the Jammu region might reignite. The killing of the Kishtwar bus passengers 30 years ago, the first of its kind, set the template for this week's communal killings and the many massacres which preceded it. Facing questions in Parliament, then Home Minister Rajesh Pilot revealed the government had very few answers. Someone told me they belong to the Afghan group, he said of the killers. I have been making inquiries at every hour to know their whereabouts. Well, we still don't. Even though some Indian intelligence officials claim that the killings were ordered by Pakistani terrorist Mohammad Sajjad Khan, also known by the pseudonym Sajjad Afghani, no perpetrator was ever brought to trial. The massacre in Kishtwar shows the jihadist threat in the Jammu region is growing again, threatening to reopen savage conflicts embedded in partition. Like it did in the face of the long-forgotten Kishtwar massacre, the government is again flailing. The bullet wounds recorded the story. In 2021, 5 soldiers had been executed at point-blank range inside an abandoned stone hut outside the mountain village of Chamrer, where they had camped when the weather turned bad. Even the soldiers ought to have maintained a guard. Army patrols headed into the mountains around Poonch and Rajouri had encountered no terrorists for a long time. 4 more soldiers were killed in a failed hunt for the terrorists who melted away into the forests. Then in August 2022, a Jaish-e-Mohammed Fidaiin suicide assault unit attacked an army post at Pargahal in Poonch, killing 5 soldiers. Again, the first attack of its kind since Kashmir's special constitutional status was revoked. Large numbers of improvised explosive devices began to be discovered on roads across rural Jammu, and efforts to infiltrate across the line of control became more regular. Following the massacre in Kishtwar, the mountains of Jammu had become a critical theatre for jihadists who were seeking to expel Hindus from the Muslim majority areas north of the Chenab River. From 1998, communal massacres gathered tempo and scale. Figures from the Jammu and Kashmir government show that 132 Hindus in the Jammu region died in 6 massacres across the state and adjoining Himachal Pradesh in just 1998. In 2001, there were 108 civilians killed in 11 major incidents, while 83 more were killed in 5 incidents in 2002. These killings were often executed with exceptional savagery. Even as women in a hamlet in Buddhal prepared food for a jihadist unit, the throats of 11 Hindu men from their families were slit. The campaign of massacres continued the following year, in 2006, when terrorists killed 19 Hindus in the hamlets of Kulhand and Tharwa. Then, as pressure mounted on Pakistan in the wake of the 26/11 attacks, these large-scale killings ended. Even though the jihadist campaign against Kashmiri Pandits has received significant media attention, the numerically larger killings of Hindus in Jammu has largely been ignored. Likely the disinterest has had something to do with the lack of social capital and the economic class of the Jammu victims. The bridegroom killed in an attack on a 1998 wedding procession in Doda's Chapnadi was wearing rubber flip-flops. Even less well reported were attacks on anti-jihadist Muslims like the massacre of 15 ethnic Bakarwal at Kot Charwal in 2001. The Hindu is a mean enemy, Lashkar-e-Taiba co-founder Hafiz Muhammad Saeed proclaimed, and the proper way to deal with him is the one adopted by our forefathers who crushed them by force. That hatred, in Saeed's case grounded in his personal experiences of partition, shapes the jihadist war in Jammu. From the elegant Mall Road in Murree, the fires of partition could be seen raging in Kashmir. Early in October 1947, the Pakistan government complained that then Maharaja Hari Singh had unleashed what they called a reign of terror. Ever since 1936, when the feudal principality of Poonch Jagir had been brought under the direct control of the Maharaja, local elites had chafed under the tax burden and various pressures. Following partition, historian Ian Copeland records, the resentment fled into a rebellion spearheaded by the Zamindar Qayyum Khan and his militia of demobilized British Indian soldiers. Even as Sikhs and Hindus were targeted in pogroms across Poonch Jagir and Mirpur, political scientist and author Christopher Snedden writes, tens of thousands of Muslims were also slaughtered in Jammu. The carnage would eventually end with less than 1,000 of the 114,000 Hindu residents of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir still living in that region. The killings in Jammu claimed over 50,000 lives and sent hundreds of thousands of refugees streaming across what we now call the line of control. The methodical attempt to wipe out whole populations, historian Yasmin Khan writes in a book on partition, depended on a well-prepared, trained, uniformed and efficient body of former soldiers, policemen and students who took the shame, honor and protection of their communities into their own hands. Gangs armed with machine guns in jeeps were able to inflict far more harm in 1 or 2 hours than villagers using lathis and pitchforks. Following the War of 1947-1948, former United Nations mediator Owen Dixon proposed replicating the logic of partition and dividing Kashmir along communal lines. This idea was rejected by both countries, albeit for different reasons. It resurfaced though in discussions held in 1955 between former Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and his counterpart in Pakistan, Chaudhry Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali pushed for control of Muslim-majority regions north of the Chenab and suggested placing Kashmir itself under some kind of joint control of a joint army. Nehru, however, dismissed this idea as completely impractical. But the idea kept re-emerging. In the 2003 negotiations between India and Pakistan, initiated by former Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee and erstwhile Pakistani military ruler General Parvez Musharraf, there were back-channel discussions on this concept. Niaz Nayak, Musharraf's negotiator, called for a division of Kashmir into 7 provinces with the Chenab as the international boundary. The US-based Kashmir Study Group also made similar proposals, which gained backing from influential politicians in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, as well as elements of the National Conference itself. Led by the Lahore-based jihad commander Sajid Saifullah Jat, once the commander of the Lashkar-e-Taiba's Kulgam area networks and married to a Kashmiri woman, the Lashkar has shown it is determined to resume its war in Jammu. The Jaish-e-Mohammed too has resumed operations and is raising funds for expanding its jihadist infrastructure, as I discussed in an earlier episode of Security Code. Levels of violence did not actually increase last year despite all the hype you might have seen, but that could change if Islamabad decides to ramp up supports for cross-LOC operations by jihadist groups. To ensure such plans fail, New Delhi must carefully consider its next steps and put national security interests ahead of electoral politics. Fears that India is engineering demographic change in Kashmir might be hugely overblown, but they run deep in the region's psychology. Following the partition violence, then Kashmir Prime Minister, as the post was then called, Sheikh Mohammad Abdullah, observed that there was no longer a single Muslim in Kapurthala, Alwar or Bharatpur. Kashmiri Muslims, he concluded, are afraid that the same fate lies ahead for them as well. The politics of communal paranoia stoked by Hindu nationalist propaganda and vigilantism has enhanced support for Islamists, leading several times through the last decade to explosive mass uprisings against India. Anger among Muslim Gujars, among the most pro-India constituencies in Jammu, has also mounted over new job reservation policies. That could further sharpen communal polarization. Fighting the coordinated communal campaign by jihadists will need a political response, not just more soldiers. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint. Thank you for listening to Security Code.